Hello, everybody, and welcome to Growth Uncut. We are doing our series around Justice 2.0, which is all about how we can bring different people into the room virtually and talk to them about what kind of upgrades they want to see within the criminal justice system to improve culture. So it's all about cultural change globally. And I am really happy to be here with Heather. Please introduce yourself, Heather, and let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for having me. It's a real pleasure. I'm Heather Whitehead, and I very recently, about a year ago, a 22-year career in prisons, initially in the field of forensic psychology and latterly as a prison governor, prison group director and the director of a private prison.
Wonderful. And tell me a little bit about your backstory. Why did you kind of get into working in this space?
I kind of fell into it, which a lot of people do. So when I was at college and going to uni, I actually wanted to be a fighter pilot, but my arms were 2 millimeters too short. So I was left going to university and wondering what to do, and found psychology and criminology and was fascinated and was immediately hooked, and was very, very clear then that that's what I wanted to do. Did my degree, got a role in a prison delivering offending behaviour programmes, and was really driven by a desire to understand why people committed offences, what was going on in their lives, what was going on for them, what was it about the way that they made decisions, and also really, really wanting to help people kind of make those changes and, you know, be the best versions of themselves and realise their potential. And that was the overarching motivating factor. And I worked in psychology for a number of years, 6 years, I think, in total. Did my master's, ran a psychology department for a while, and very, very quickly, well, I realised a few things. One was that a lot of people in prison were not that different to me. And it was interesting to kind of think about, well, what was it about my life and where I grew up that's really similar to some of these people? What were those little things that made the difference? And while some of those are kind of internal things, a lot of those were external factors and things outside of people's control. And at the same time, also started to realise that although I believed I was doing some amazing work with some of these individuals in prison, the system wasn't always supporting that change and wasn't always promoting those behaviours or thinking styles or attitudes and ways of being that we were trying to promote. So I had a kind of put up or shut up moment, and I decided that prisons was the place for me. I did want to work with people in custody to get a better life, but what I needed to do was be part of the system and get into a leadership role so that I could try and change things. So that's what I did in 2008, and I went on to manage almost all functions. I never managed reducing reoffending, but every other function in prisons. Went on to be a deputy governor, prison group director, and then moved to the private sector, really from the perspective of I'd kind of got to where I ever wanted to get to in the public sector and missed being closer to the action, I always say, closer to staff, closer to those in custody, and also really wanted to work in a more agile environment where innovation was easier. I say easier in inverted commas, where I thought innovation would be easier. It was in some ways and not in others, but to go and kind of develop those commercial skills as well and to see what was possible in a different sector.
So there's something there that I'm hearing around wanting to make an impact and having influence, like having a voice. But there's also something around people there, I guess, in terms of being close to people and working with people, I guess, in that kind of way. What was it about, I guess, for those that may be listening that have never been in a prison, but what is it about working with people in prison, whether that's the staff or the people that are living there, that brings you meaning?
I think working with people that were living in prison, it was the diversity of people, you were surprised all the time by people's backgrounds, their skills, what they had to offer, what their plans were, what their circumstances were. It really, really challenges assumptions that we all have, even those of us that kind of work hard and engage in reflective practice to not have those assumptions about people and all of that great stuff. It really, really challenged you to think, actually, you know, these people are just like everybody else. And they, you know, it's that kind of 3 degrees of separation, isn't it? 3 bad decisions, and it could be any one of us. And sometimes it's 3 bad decisions that we don't even necessarily have control over. Maybe we have influence, maybe we don't. Maybe we're a child and we don't have any control over that. And it carves that path, and actually being able to see the potential in those people and then help them realize that for themselves. Actually, it's not even giving them the tools a lot of the time. It's when the penny drops and they're like, actually, I could have a different life. Oh, wow. And then working with the staff, I think, you know, particularly prison officers, but all staff, It is one of the hardest jobs in the world.
Absolutely.
One of the hardest jobs in the world. And I did a fast track program. I didn't spend years on the landing. And I genuinely don't know if I could have, because it is extremely challenging. But when you see staff and the difference that they make with people and those little things, I could give you stories, and as you could, Sarah, about big things that staff have done for people that have made a big difference. But the most powerful are those little things, going to see someone who's going home to say good luck on their way to the gym at lunchtime. It's nothing, but it means so much that the person leaving thinks, oh my gosh, they actually care enough to come. And our prisons are full of those people, and people who joined to make that difference. It's not always easy for them to do it, and I'm sure none of them are doing it as much as they would like to, which that's one of the reasons that I left. I felt my impact was actually eroded over time, but it is full of people who know how powerful that is and want to do that more often.
I mean, it's inspiring, isn't it? And I just listened to you, and just there's so many different memories there, and I imagine, like you say, you've got them as well, of those individuals that, in spite of everything, get up and get back onto those landings and just still go for it and still really try and connect with people and see them. And it's really lovely now working with some of the guys and girls that are out of prison and talk about their stories, about what was it that kind of changed the kind of the road you kind of went on when you were going down. And like you say, it's those small things, the small person who just said, I believe in you, or the small person who saw something good in you, or it was something that was really significant. So lovely, absolutely lovely, heartwarming to hear. And segueing into a heart question, what topics or areas of justice, criminal justice, are close to your heart? What are the things that really matter to you in terms of topics?
So there's probably 3 or 4. The most obvious one is children in custody, youth justice. I have worked in my time, I'm very lucky to have worked with men, women, children, young adults across all categories, but I've always kind of been drawn back to working with younger people in custody. And I just feel like we know what we need to do. I go back 10 years and we had a target operating model or way of working with young adults in custody, a way of specialising services that were trauma informed, were designed for a more adolescent brain, that weren't about 28 days punishment for X, that was written for a 40-year-old man. Generally, we knew what we needed to do, and then the pressures in the system forced the system to dissipate that population, and the level of service that they get is not as good. And of course, children in custody, it's great that we now have so few children in custody and the numbers are so few, but those children that are in custody are so complex in terms of their needs. I don't think people realise, because you think therefore the children in custody have often done some pretty horrific things, and at that point they do pose quite significant risks, and there is obviously a public protection element, and I don't dispute that. But for most of them, prior to that, they were a case on someone's caseload for their vulnerability and for their needs not being met. And for whatever reason, those services were not able to address those vulnerabilities and those complexities and meet those needs. And then once that child's behaviour reaches a threshold or becomes criminalised, which often happens sooner if they're in the care system, they all of a sudden switch to being wholly accountable for everything they've ever done, where maybe only months before they were living in they were in a children's home as a welfare child because they've been neglected and abused and perhaps weren't engaged in education. And it's extremely challenging to work with that population in custody, and the staff that work with children in custody rightly deserve a medal. It is extremely challenging, but I think we could still do so much better with kids in custody. We don't do well with kids in custody. It's not an easy gig, let me be clear. There's not like a golden ticket over here and this is what we do, but we do have a lot of evidence of what we could do better for children and young adults. And I think the system just needs to be brave enough to do it, if I'm honest. The other things are, you would expect me to say, staff culture and leadership. That's why I do what I do now. So a culture that is centred around a relational approach, a culture centred in trust and permission. There's a lot of us, and I know, I've learned from a lot of really exceptional, experienced prison governors with a lot more experience than me, who would say things like, and I don't say this flippantly because these are risks that you're managing in prison, but, is someone going to die or is someone going to escape? And if they're not, then actually, why don't we try? And I think sometimes we've just stopped enabling and empowering. And in fact, it's not just enabling, it's expecting people who work in that system to contribute and to challenge and to have those conversations and to push that system forward. So there's something about that for me. And of course, leadership, you know, I've gone through that system. It can be a bit sink or swim. Great operators are promoted. Some get training, some don't. Some get reflective practice, some don't. Some get coaching, some don't. There isn't a framework that's consistent, and none of the above, to my knowledge. Things may have moved on, but certainly not in my experience, really centered around values-based leadership and relational approaches. Understandably, there's a lot of management training because there's a lot of things to manage in a prison. You know, it's a very complex operational place, but actually that bit about how you really hold your nerve and stay true to those values under the most challenging of circumstances, and not revert to kind of, you know, perhaps the behaviours and cultures that we don't want to see under pressure, needs more focus, 100%. I think more on lived experience. You know, I think the first prison group director to recruit someone with lived experience into their operational central team to go in and out of prisons. So not just policy advice, actually be part of that team, and that person's still in post, which is brilliant and is doing a cracking job. But again, we didn't go far enough. We started to listen. We hadn't quite got to co-creation. That's probably trickier with kids, but there are organisations out there doing it much better than us. There's more to do there to really bring that. And since leaving, actually, and working with people like you, actually, Sarah and Cam, and working with Getting as I do now, kind of, even with this being one of my passions, I think I underestimated the potential of just how transformational kind of that whole system approach could be. So yeah, they would be the things that I would say are closest to my heart.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely love all of those passions. There's something for me about, you know, we talk a lot about collaboration and innovation, and I think there's something about what gets in the way of collaboration and innovation. And for me, that's the culture that we currently have. You know, like there's something about, we need to trust each other if we're going to collaborate. We need to let go. It's not about us if we're collaborating. It's about the we, you know, it's about everyone equally. It's not necessarily about self-service in that kind of way, but also there's just something about innovation when you have a culture that when you make a mistake, there's fear, and you kind of got that kind of grip around, you know, you better not make a mistake. And, you know, that kind of real being governed by fear on a bigger systemic kind of level. I think it's really difficult to be innovative, isn't it?
Yes, it's that difference, isn't it, between a blame culture that, and I'm not saying, I'm not criticizing individuals, because I think there is a genuine desire to have accountability and not a blame culture, but I think it comes out as a blame culture, and then what you actually end up with is poor accountability when it's necessary, and stifling people who are so frightened to make a mistake that they're going to get kind of hauled over the coals that they don't. And I was just reflecting actually on the recent HMIP thematic about trust and relationships in the young offender institutions and why Park is different. And, you know, I was lucky enough to be the director of Park for a short period. And I genuinely, there's loads of things people will say are different. Yes, it's a smaller unit, but it's also a Cat A unit. Yes, there's fewer children, but not much fewer than Feltham maybe at the time. The biggest difference is, I think, having worked in or led all of them, is a permissive culture. It's a permissive culture to just do things differently. And I'm not taking credit for creating that. That's what I arrived into. That's what I observed as the PGD. And that is what made the biggest difference. The staff there would just do. They would just go and do, and they would just tell you what they were doing, and they would tweak it if it didn't go well. And there were some amazing practices that went on there because there was this kind of, the culture was permissive, and then the kind of the systems enabled people to do that as well. So it was, you could just go down the road and speak to the food bank and say, can we do this? It wasn't bureaucratic, it wasn't challenging. And then the next week the kids were making meals for the food bank, you know, that's how easy it was.
Yeah. And I guess thinking about those kind of topics, but also maybe other things that are kind of close to your heart around upgrading justice, specifically looking at leadership. So if you were to think about what are the things that we need to either let go of, and you've touched on some of those already, but around leadership, what would you love to see if we can have another, let's say another podcast in 5 years' time? What do we want to be talking about that's happened?
So I would like the system to be based on relational leadership and relational approaches with staff, with teams, with those that are living in prison, fundamentally. And some of the steps that I think that we could take to do that are, just reflect on what I said before, definitely more about a values-based approach to leadership in terms of selection of people and in terms of really supporting them in how to lead in a values-centered way, you know, in an organization that is enhanced in some ways and crippled in others by lots and lots of policy and frameworks and governance. Actually, then, you know, they need to be more values-led, and we've got to start to prioritize things like compassion and inclusion and create psychological safety. And you know, in all of my training as a leader, I don't think anyone ever spoke to me about psychological safety and what that meant. So as a link to that, how do you get to that? Well, then there needs to be a structured leadership development framework for potential leaders and leaders as they move through the grades. And I think there needs to be a lot of consistency between what we do with operational and non-operational managers and leaders, because there is huge diversity of background, thought, skill, approach that will only make that institution and the wider organisation stronger. And I think there needs to be greater parity and partnership across those professions. So for me, that needs to be much more structured, and it needs to be, like I say, relationship and leadership centric, as well as all those really other important things like, you know, your incident management and those things that are absolutely critical. Governors in particular, and I think if governors got it, this would hopefully filter through, need greater autonomy. The role of the governor now to where it was kind of 20 years ago when I was first going into kind of prison management and, you know, learning about it, it was so different. So different. And that does need to come then with greater accountability. But one of the things that I experienced as a governor, and I think you find ways to get around this as you become more experienced, but certainly as a new governor, there were a lot more people and processes saying no to me than yes. And there wasn't many ways outside of your kind of network of finding out ways to navigate some of that. And I think, you know, now working in business, there needs to be a greater acceptance of spectrum, that there are processes, and, you know, so people will often say ask forgiveness, not permission. You know, there are things that not everything is as important that it's followed 100%, but I think the culture is a compliance culture, and I think governors need to be enabled and empowered to be able to navigate that with greater autonomy, and with that comes accountability. And I know in my experience that's what I would have welcomed, and I'm confident that that's what a lot of my colleagues would welcome now. I don't think they fear accountability. I think often there's a criticism that people aren't held to account, but it's actually quite complex to hold, you know, governors to account for things like education delivery when they don't have any responsibility for the contracts and they're not involved in commissioning of the contracts or the contract management. So that's just one example. But you know, the procurement processes, there are lots of things that are outside the sphere of control and some outside the sphere of influence that are therefore that make it quite difficult to act autonomously, to innovate, and then to hold people to account if they don't deliver.
Yeah. And in some senses, it moves on to our next kind of question, which is around those kind of challenges. And you've already talked about that. I think there's something about that kind of compliance culture, you know, get pulled over the coals, we get put on the naughty step, you know, all these kind of phrases. I think that's it's the fear of, if I don't comply, what does that kind of mean? But for you, looking at your experiences, what were the challenges, and what challenges do you see, I guess, around the leadership space that actually makes it really hard to maybe achieve that kind of upgrade that we're kind of looking at?
So I guess to briefly reflect on what I was just saying about accountability, one of the challenges is the fragmentation of services. So the complex commissioning arrangements and the ways that the services are divided up and delivered across custody, health, education, social care, substance misuse. You know, like when I was at Park, I think we had 4 different providers for all different bits of health. And that from a governance point of view, that's quite complex. But actually then getting people to work together and aligned on vision and strategy, that is pretty tricky and could be simplified. But the cultural inertia and that compliance mentality and mindset, I think, has been one of the ones that was most challenging. So as a governor and as a prison group director, you know, trying to lead on a national reform programme, and, you know, my experience is that we are judged on a traffic light system, and we are very, very focused on a path to green and doing all those things that we said that we would do in an action plan. And I spent a lot of time with senior leaders that I managed, governors, like really making sure that my assurance teams were saying, okay, so we thought actions 1 to 10 would achieve this outcome, and we've done actions 1 to 10, brilliant, green, everything's green, but have they delivered the outcome? And actually, they might have been the right activities, but has something else changed that means that that outcome isn't the right one anymore? But kind of that compliance audit, path to green, RAG rating. And you are right, it was the weighted scorecard and then the performance framework and your audit results. Those things do shine a light on you for the wrong reasons. And that can bring challenge and sometimes support that feels like challenge, if I'm honest. Going through an urgent notification process with a prison in my region, not all of the support that was designed to be supportive felt supportive or actually enabled progression and change. It's culturally an organisation that bears down on poor performance, that doesn't create space and growth and kind of go, right, what do you need? It kind of bears down, but genuinely from a good place, but it doesn't always feel like that when you're on the other end. So there's something about that I think really makes it difficult then to navigate that change in a way that you really want to. And then the other thing, towards the end of my career in prisons, when I was at Park and also contract managing other contracts, I think sometimes there are misaligned incentives in contracts that drive the wrong behaviours. And sometimes that drives behaviour that gets focused on kind of contractual delivery, KPIs, SDIs, whatever we want to call them, that is not responsive or agile to actually what's actually going on at the time. So I don't know, for example, I'm just going to make this up, but getting assessments done within 5 days of coming into custody. Actually, for some children or adults coming into their first 5 days, they may be on a detox. Is it the right time to do that for them? But there isn't kind of always the scope. I'm using this as an example because I don't actually know if there is flex on that for the education contracts, but things like that drive providers or governors and their teams themselves to just do the activity that gets the tick in the box, gets the green, whereas the best leaders kind of step away and constructively challenge that culture and that inertia to kind of, actually, I know that, for example, we're supposed to do key work with everybody once. I can't even remember what it is. Is it once a fortnight? It used to be. And for some people who perhaps were doing 25-year tariffs, that wasn't enough. So we're not going to do that. And, towards the end, there was a shift towards being more permissive. But for a period of time, that was really, really rigid. And that kind of one size fits all doesn't really create the space for leaders to bring themselves and to do those innovative things that they want to do. And in the worst cases, it drives the absolute wrong behaviour, because assessing someone within that 5 days who's not emotionally, psychologically or physically stable is only going to do them harm. And one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, didn't mention actually around an upgrade, but I think it's a key part, is building that trauma responsive approach into the system, because it's not just about doing things, because sometimes these things might be inadvertently harmful.
That's it. And I guess looking at that in terms of the impact, all the things you've talked about, the things around maybe not having consistent reflective practice, not having consistent coaching, not talking about psychological safety, that pressure kind of bearing down, what impact do you see on leaders, and I guess from your own experience as well, but what is the impact of that on the people? I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily look, it's the SMT, do you know what I mean? Or it's the SMT. It's not necessarily people, but it is people, isn't it? It's in exactly the same way. What impact do you feel it has on people?
Undoubtedly, it affects people's well-being. Undoubtedly. It's and I think I certainly didn't appreciate how much working under that degree of pressure with that level of responsibility, particularly with some of the challenges in youth custody and at Park, at peak times, not all the time, but at peak times, you just don't see how much that takes out on you. I work hard to maintain my resilience. I do lots of, good stuff. We all have our own ways. I do lots of good stuff to maintain that, but it's not static. And it's not a refilling pot. Do you know what I mean? An automatically refilling pot. And I think it really, really takes its toll. And what you then see, in some people, is compassion fatigue, which is awful, because I said earlier, everybody joins the job really genuinely, I believe, to make a difference. And sometimes in an effort to survive in some of those challenging circumstances, you see compassion fatigue. I think the service loses people because of it. And I think those that even kind of have it all down, they're all over it, they end up carrying a lot more because of that, particularly when a system is under a lot of pressure as it is now, lots of inexperienced staff, workforce instability. And I don't just mean governors and SMT. I mean, I'm talking down to, if you're an officer on the wing who's got 18 months experience, all of a sudden you might be in charge, and really you're still learning your craft. And that isn't how we learned back in the day. And that's a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility, particularly when you're then operating in a culture of, oh, if I drop the ball with that and make a mistake, I'm going to get in loads of trouble.
Yeah.
Like that creates hypervigilance and all of those things that not only are harmful then to the individuals in those circumstances, but of course, because we're in a community, that is reflected then and mirrored in the men or women or kids that are living there. But when you see, you know, guided reflective practice delivered consistently, which we were able to do in some of our youth sites really well, like it makes such a difference. And, you know, again, you asked for my experience. I need to practice what I preach sometimes. I've always been the one saying, right, we need to do this for staff and we'll get that for the SLT and we'll need to do that. And I didn't always ask or force myself to engage in those processes. And I think kind of more central leadership needs to make, genuinely, I think they need to make that more mandatory and routine so that it doesn't feel like a response to a traumatic incident. It actually builds resilience and it's a preventative approach.
Yeah, that's it. And like you say, it's values based, you know, like I'm really fortunate to do kind of growth supervision with a number of governing governors. And I think, I mean, there is just something about having a space, and it's not necessarily about work. It's about things that maybe can impact you on your work, but it's about anything you want to bring to the table, anything that you've just, you know, that is still in your mind and you haven't shaken off, anything that you feel maybe more emotionally about than you would normally do. And it's those consistent conversations that as you build them up, you know, I'm, you know, probably on, you know, over a year now working with some people and seeing the changes in them, saying, oh, you seem a little distant this month, you know, or you seem really motivated this month, so let's talk about that, you know. So I think there's just something about, you know, in Norway they always talked about you need to see people, and I think a lot of the time we don't see leaders as people firstly, but also see what they actually have to kind of go through, because you're always on call, you know. I guess that's what I've done on the way, that there's no switching off, you know. There's always that back of that mind when maybe you have a glass of wine on Friday night that you may get a phone call from a prison, and that phone call's probably not going to be a great call if they're calling you and you're not expecting it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the stuff that really,
and when you start to feel sick when your phone goes because you think it's the prison, like they are signs that, hang on, this isn't kind of a manageable level of stress. Absolutely.
How did it feel stepping out of that?
So I felt so many different ways stepping out of it. I felt a huge weight had been lifted. Like, I know this sounds ridiculous, but being like not having to have my phone, not wondering if it's charged or not, if it's flat, I could have left it at home. Like that was just, and my kids noticed that, you know, I felt much more present. And, you know, that again, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing. I'm as responsible for not managing that, but I think that culturally that's just the way of working that I got into. I made the decision to leave for loads of reasons and wanted to do different things, wanted to be closer to home, wanted, you know, didn't feel I was having the same impact in the organization when it was struggling as much as it was. But I also felt like I'd lost my identity like completely, because it was what I was. You've just said we don't see leaders as people. I was a prison governor. I was a prison group director. Like, now what am I? You know, and I stepped back and took some time to think about what it was that I enjoyed, wanted to do, what drove me. And it was nice to reconnect with that. And you summarized it. You're a very good listener because you summarized it well with kind of, it is that people stuff. So I do loads of stuff now, and I do consultancy and justice because obviously it's still the sector that I know and love. But I also do things that I feel are doing social good. I work with charities, I work with schools, I work with children who are at risk of exclusion, because, you know, I'm like on a one-woman mission to kind of disrupt that school exclusion to prison pipeline and try and work more in that prevention space. I work with new business owners because I love to see people grow and thrive, and it all goes back to that wanting to see people achieve their potential. So whether that's someone coming out of prison, whether that's a prison officer coming into their own, whether that's a aspiring leader or a new prison governor or a business owner now or a teacher, that kind of coaching, training and development, creating reflective spaces, working with senior teams. I kind of design and facilitate workshops to help them strategize and get out of the weeds and try and do culture change. So yeah, I've ended up doing all the bits of the job that I loved in a different context, but it was pretty scary along the way. It was exciting, thrilling, petrifying, a relief, a stress, like it was everything, and still is some days. But I'm it's given me great clarity on when it really matters to me and what I think I really bring to an organisation or the people that I work with.
It's really interesting you say it, because we take people away. So we take people to Norway, as you know, we take senior leaders out there, and we did this year in February. It was approved premises leaders, and it's that space that you talked about. It's about having space that's not where you are, like you say, coming out of the weeds, but there's just something about, at the end of that, we thought it would be about, you know, we were setting visions, we were talking about, you know, start with the end in mind, and what are the values, and doing all the strategic stuff that we were going to be doing as part of the masterclass out there. But what was really interesting is that when we asked them, what did you get from this experience? And they went to some amazing, inspirational Norwegian APs and community hubs, and it was just incredible in terms of what they witnessed. But in terms of the learning they got, was I reconnected with the reason I do this job. And that was consistent across the board. And I think that is, if we could just do that, if the service or the sector could just give that real opportunity for someone to just go away and get some space and make some sense of things and gain that clarity, it re-energizes you, doesn't it? Because
Completely.
then you know where you're going and where you're heading. But all the time you're in it, it's like this dark hole that you can't gain the perspective, you can't reflect, you can't necessarily give yourself compassion, all of these things. If we could just take them away for a little time, like a little bit of respite, I think it would just do wonders. It would do wonders for our people.
I think the physical relocation does make a massive difference, like taking teams out to go and think. It's not just the mental headspace, is it? But what you just said about cutting through the noise, I think one of the things I learned most was, you know, there will always be 15 different departments with 27 different priorities, and there'll always be 10 risks on your risk register, and there'll always be 25 actions to do under, you know, but actually cutting through that and simplifying things and keeping a real focus really helps staff with their well-being and managing change. It helps you as a leader respond to the inevitable kind of ministerial shifts and, you know, spending review changes and all of these things that come, and workforce reform and workforce restructuring. But if you've got that clarity of focus for your establishment about what's really important, and that is centered in those core kind of that core purpose about, you know, keeping people safe, keeping people secure, and giving them all of the tools, opportunities and space to change for good, that you can't go wrong if you keep that focus. And if that's what you bring things back to, and that will always bring it back to relationships, and it'll always bring it back to trust. And to do that, people have got to spend time together.
Yeah, that's it. It's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I could talk to you for hours, but we've run out of time. But let's reconnect. I think there's something about, you know, following you on your journey, advocating for the work that you're doing, and hopefully us working together in the future and doing some great stuff. But I think in terms of, I'm really hoping, and it is for me, it's an inspiration to listen to your honesty and to listen to the kind of journey that you've had, and how you are still just really passionate about what you're doing and passionate about people and impact. So it's Friday afternoon, folks. No one will know that because you may be listening at any point in the world or any time zone, but it's 5 o'clock on a Friday. And so I think there's just something to just accept that that's amazing that we've just had such a lovely conversation that's really, really centered on passion and people and your commitment. So thanks so much, Heather. It's lovely having you here.
No, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Lovely. Last question. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, how might they get in touch with you, Heather?
So LinkedIn seems to be the best place at the moment. So I'm Heather Whitehead MSc on LinkedIn. If you look for HW Leadership Consultancy, I've got a website, or you can email me. It's the longest email in the world because you can tell I'm not an IT person and set it up on my own. But it's Heather Whitehead at hwleadershipconsultancy.co.uk. But please reach out. And if you're connected with Sarah, which you probably are if you're listening to this, then we're connected on LinkedIn and you'll find me.
Yeah, lovely. And if you want to learn more about Justice 2.0, we have our strategy on our website, www.growtransformbelong.com. And if you want to get in touch with us, of course, just info@growtransformbelong.com. So thanks again. Have a lovely weekend. And all the best.
Thanks.